So we are now ready to go. And I'll just jump right in, let you know that I'm going to be talking about two completely, well, unrelated topics today. And the first is the politics of the reopening of the government. And as you're well aware, right after the longest shutdown in the history of the federal government of the United States, it has now reopened. Legislation that had been blocked in the Senate for a long time was eventually signed, a deal hammered out by a group of 8 senators, 7 Democrats, 1 independent, and a number of Republicans. And the concessions that the Democrats got were very minimal, not directly related to what they were holding out for, which is to say, for restoration of the Obamacare or Affordable Care Act subsidies that had been cut in the One Big Beautiful Bill or allowed to expire in the One Big Beautiful Bill. And the recriminations have been coming fast and hard. The idea that the Democratic Party seemed to have a lot of leverage and that it folded when it seemed to be doing a lot of damage to Donald Trump um, is the ground for that recrimination. But having said that, I'm going to try to analyze this not just in a one-sided vantage, but to consider, well, what might have led the 8 people who did vote to reopen the government after getting minimal concessions, what might have motivated them, and are there good considerations perhaps on both sides of this issue, as opposed to one side having all of the insight and the other side simply having caved. But having done that, and I will spend a little bit of time on that, I want to also talk about the fact that the 30th Conference of the Participants is occurring right now in Brazil. And to give you a little bit of a sense of what the agenda is for that meeting, but then to also notice that although it's the 30th COP, as we call them, it is the 10th anniversary of the Paris Climate Accords, which were signed in November of 2015, and to take a little bit of a survey of what's happening in terms of climate change, but also how well the Paris Accords are working, where they don't seem to be working as well, and to get a sense then of a decade now worth of a framework that we can perhaps get a little bit better sense how the world is responding to the fact that this new accord has now been influencing policy around the world for roughly a decade. So those are the two main topics, and I will jump right into the first one. And I want to pose the question in as direct a way as possible. Did the Democrats simply surrender and cave in, and were they inept and short-sighted in doing so? And the case to be made for this relates to the fact that Donald Trump's approval rating is at its all-time low for his second term. And while I don't believe that there is such a thing as momentum in these kinds of aggregate polls or averages of many polls, I do want to suggest that the forces driving Trump's approval rating down seem to be broader than the government shutdown. And so if it were just the case that, Donald Trump was doing reasonably well until the government shut down, and then, he tanked, and that's the right explanation for his loss of approval, then it would seem to me that the case to continue doing the thing that damages not only your partisan rival, but someone who you believe is a genuine threat to American democracy, is an aspiring autocrat carrying out an autocrat's playbook, is targeting large numbers of people who have a right to be in your country for summary deportation, who is reasserting racial hierarchy, and some of whose supporters are flirting increasing with anti-Semitism and other forms of just vile racial politics, then you should keep the screws, right? Tightening as much as you can. Why in the world would we surrender our one successful weapon in the fight against Donald Trump in his second term in office? So that's the nature of the criticism. And please note, by the way, it's not just that Donald Trump's approval rating is cratering, it's also that the Democrats did extraordinarily well across the board, really ran the boards in the elections last Tuesday in the way that we talked about last Saturday. And so there's just a strong case in terms of partisan strategy to be made to keep the pressure up or to keep the damage landing on a president who is, right, in many respects, deeply dangerous. Now, having said that, I want to immediately backtrack and say it's not at all clear to me that the right way to read Tuesday's results or right the downward trend in Donald Trump's approval rating is entirely to do with the government shutdown. And so I bring onto the board something else, right? And this is a longer time frame than this by far. This diagram goes back really just to January of 2025 when Trump first assumed office in his second term. This diagram goes all the way back to January of 2007 and then tracks consumer confidence in the 2008 Great Recession and note how far down it fell and how long it took for it to come back up. And then the cratering in consumer confidence around the COVID emergency, around the spike in inflation. And then please note, it's remarkable that consumer confidence right now is lower than it's been in any of those periods. And I will just point out one implication of the government being shut down is that we do not have some of the most important and insightful economic data about how our economy is doing, how job creation, how unemployment, how wages are holding up over the last couple months. But right, this data is collected by the University of Michigan, not collected by the government, so it's still coming in. And this seems to indicate that there may be some really bad data lurking out there that we've been unable to detect. And that what's driving Donald Trump's approval rating down is not only that he's playing political football with people who are poor and hungry during a government shutdown while he is demolishing the East Wing to make way for a tacky ballroom, and that he is hosting a Gilded Age theme Halloween party and accepting, right, Rolodex watches and a gold bar in the Oval Office. All of this, right, during a government shutdown in which tens of millions of Americans are suffering, right? And so, yes, there is a way in which the shutdown highlighted the indecency, the inhumanity, the total lack of compassion and sympathy, the total self-centered, egoistic narcissism of Donald Trump, right? And yet, I do also want to say, frankly, if that stuff wasn't obvious, right, before the shutdown, well, I guess there are a large number of Americans who are just not paying that much attention. But the more plausible explanation seems to me to be, look, the tariffs have really damaged the economy. And perhaps the economy was already on its way into worse territory, and the tariffs have just accelerated what was going to already be a slowdown. Or to put it differently, right, to focus on a different issue, that Americans are very unhappy with the use of federal law enforcement authorities to go after working people who may not have documentation to be here, but are certainly providing valuable services to their community and doing no harm, right? It's one thing to use federal law enforcement to go after criminals. It's another thing to use it to terrorize entire communities and neighborhoods. And that seems to be what the Trump administration is doing in the name of, quote, deporting hardened criminals. Or to notice, right, that the Trump administration is blowing up boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific, that it's using tariffs in ways that it looks like the Supreme Court is extremely skeptical of, that it is abusing its power, that it is over interpreting or misinterpreting its mandate to do things much more radical than what the voters actually gave Donald Trump a relatively narrow victory to do, and that the institutions of American democracy are failing to correct course when the president over interprets and abuses the mandate and power that he has, right? And so with that more complicated understanding of maybe why the Democrats won and why Donald Trump's approval rating is cratering, you then need to ask, I think, a further question. And I'll focus first on the SNAP benefits. We'll return to them with just a refresher in a few minutes. But the idea that, look, the senators represent people who are calling their offices and saying, I can't feed my children. I can't feed my disabled adult dependent. My parents are struggling. We can't even make it to the food bank because we don't have enough money to pay the gas for the car. You got to do something about this, right? And that a humane approach to a president who is clearly indecent and inhumane may involve having to say, well, we're going to do the right thing. And yes, we're going to surrender our strategic advantage here because we know who we're playing with. And there's no way that Donald Trump is actually going to restore the Obamacare subsidies. He would rather, right, defy court orders for restoring the SNAP benefits. He would rather see millions of people descend into hunger and food insecurity than admit the need to compromise with the other party. That is who we're dealing with. And so we have to be the responsible players here. And by the way, I just will say this very quickly, the idea that the Democratic Party is trying to show itself to be a better functioning political party in a representative democracy than the Republican Party, which has essentially become a personality cult for a deranged individual, right? And so the idea that the Democratic Party shows itself to have a diverse coalition, that it represents different states and different people, and that it does so by accommodating internal difference. And some of the senators did feel that it was time to end the shutdown, not because they'd won, but because the cost of continuing it was too extreme. So they signed an agreement that got the best they thought they could get. And so the idea, and I just want to be as clear as possible about this, that if the interpretation of what happened in the election, what's happening in Donald Trump's approval rating is correct, that this wasn't just about the shutdown, that this is about Donald Trump really revealing himself to be indecent in the context of the shutdown, but also abusive in the way in which he exercises political power. We knew that from 4 years ago, but it's even worse this time around. Then there's no reason to think that this trend line won't continue. And by the way, what's happening, and I'll do my best not to talk very much about this, but with the vote on the so-called Epstein files, right? Not the tranche of emails that was released from the Epstein estate by Congress earlier this week, but the files in the possession of the Department of Justice, right? And the House will vote probably next week. And I suspect we're going to see a fair number of Republicans vote, and that this is going to be a sign that the Republicans in Congress who have to run for office next year and then again in 2028 recognize that Donald Trump's popularity, which maybe got them control of Congress in 2024, is no longer an asset for them. As a matter of fact, he has become a deeply unpopular man, and that this means that the Democrats didn't need to damage further the hungry people of the United States. That the damage is being done to Donald Trump and his Republican coalition by the extreme and inhumane and abusive policies that they're pursuing. So I will say very quickly again, right? We've looked at this already. I just want to underline that the doubling of the population that relies on federal government assistance to feed their families in the 21st century, the doubling of the proportion of the population, the fact that the vast majority of these people work and that a large plurality of them have children who depend on them. All of this should be part of the consideration of what's wrong with the American economy. And here I think I want to drill down on this issue, right? The short term perspective focuses on the government shutdown, the politics of 2025 and 2026, which party is going to gain advantage as we begin to pivot into the next congressional election cycle. But there are deeper problems that this reveals, right? The fact that 40 million plus Americans rely on the government to be able to put food on their table, to not have to feel the awful anxiety of food insecurity, given how rich we are as a society, given how much wealth our economy generates year in, year out. There is something deeply wrong with our economy. It's not just the politics of 2025. Similarly, right, we were fighting over the right Obamacare subsidies. And please note again, right, that the population in the Obamacare program has doubled. And here I want to take this opportunity to talk both about this legislation and about the deeper issues to do with the provision of medical care in the United States. And so please note, right, that what Obamacare has done in the decade plus that it's been enforced now is to reduce the number of people without health insurance in the United States by more than 50%. And by the way, it looks like roughly 10 million people, 7 to 10 million people, will probably come off of Obamacare without the subsidies. And that means that a third or 50% of those people almost who have gotten health care, have gotten insurance under Obamacare, will fall out of the insurance markets. And the result is going to be a large number of people who don't have health care who did have it last year, right? And to be as clear as possible, I think the Democrats who say, look, this is what we were fighting for. And by the way, yes, there are a lot of really hungry people in the United States whose situation is being made worse by the government shutdown and by the cruelty of the president, his willingness to treat them as a political football, his willingness to completely disobey the orders of judges, his willingness to continue to challenge those orders rather than just to do the decent thing. But please note that next year there'll be a whole other category of vulnerable people, people who will experience pain and illness and who will let diseases that could be treated fester until they get to be so acute that they may no longer be able to be treated. And by the way, this won't just drive up the number of people who are uninsured and vulnerable, and this will have spillover effects. This too will create hunger for vulnerable Americans. It will also damage all of our healthcare because, right, ultimately, these people, when they do get so sick that the ambulance takes them to the hospital, are going to get care because that's the law of our country. And then, if they can't afford to pay for that care, the rest of us will ultimately pay for that care because the hospital and the insurance companies will swallow the cost and pass it on to the rest of us in premiums or increased expenses for procedures. This was worth fighting for, and although it may not be as visceral, it may not be as salient as knowing that 40 plus million people are experiencing food insecurity, this is a different kind of insecurity that the Democrats could have continued to fight for. I want to now focus a little bit more on the healthcare system and to think for a moment why we're in this situation to begin with. And I want to be as clear as possible. The Affordable Care Act has not fixed American healthcare. It prevented it from getting worse in certain respects. It provided insurance for people who didn't have it, made that insurance affordable. Those are important accomplishments. But frankly, they do not address the underlying problems with the healthcare system. In formulating this, I've come across, and I think it's very valuable, an article on a Substack by Caitlin Jetelina and Hayden Rookley, and Rookley is with Brown University School of Public Health, a medical school there, and they have put together this indication: 5 ways our healthcare system has become utterly insane. I'm going to focus on 4 of them. The first is costs versus wages, right? And so deductibles have gone up 128% from 2009 to 2025. Premiums have gone up almost 100% in that same period. Out-of-pocket expenses almost 80%. Wages only 65%, right? And so the deductibles are more than twice what the wages are. I shouldn't say more than, right about twice what the wages are. And this is indicative, right, of the broader issue that really played out in the 2025 elections, I think also the 2024 elections, and that is the fact that we are experiencing an affordability crisis in this country, and that medical care, along with housing, along with education, along with childcare, is really, really driving this sense that we just can't afford services and goods that are non-discretionary. You can't live without them, right? And the idea that medical care inflation is driving overall inflation, is totally exceeding wage growth, is a problem that is deeper than just, do we extend the Affordable Care Act subsidies, but that the Affordable Care Act subsidies leads us to focus on. And again, I do think one of the questions here is how in 2025, in the second Trump presidency, 2026 as well, do we get Americans to focus on the issues that we think they need to focus on and keep them from falling into, right, the churning spectacle of conflict and scandal that is Trump's second administration. This was a good strategy to do this, but it didn't really attack the root problem. Another way to look at the root problem is to notice, right, again, drawing on this article, that we have a very high level of avoidable mortality in this country compared with the European Union or developed countries, right? Almost 50% higher than the average for developed countries. And what that means is that there are conditions that, if they are treated, would be curable or non fatal, but that we don't get medical care to people on time or adequately. And so we have a high rate, and you can see it's unevenly distributed, but a high rate of avoidable mortality in the United States. And then add to that, right? If you look at the cost of healthcare in the United States per person, per capita, right? It is double the average of these societies that have a much lower rate of avoidable mortality. We pay the most and get the least, is the way Jedalina and Ruckley put it, and I think that's absolutely right. Three more issues, two of them identified by these authors. The third, right, is that the problem is not overutilization of healthcare. And to demonstrate this, they use a simple example: hip replacements per 100,000 people. And by the way, we're in the middle of a lifespan revolution. People are living into their 70s, 80s, and 90s. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that. And unfortunately, the human body is not really designed to last that long in every regard, right? And so the frequency with which people are having their hips replaced reflects the fact that we're all living longer, and that it maintains our mobility, it avoids pain, it keeps us healthy in other regards, to address, as we now can, joint decay. And so we look at this and we notice, right, that in the developed world, we have a rather high rate of hip replacements, 254 per 100,000 people per year. And in the United States, our rate of hip replacement is less than a third, right? And then we notice, by the way, if we look at what this costs, if you have private insurance, it's almost $30,000. How much does it cost if you have private insurance in the rest of the developed world? Well, there is no figure there, because the rest of the developed world doesn't really rely on private insurance, right? There's a meme going around. Single payer public health care is really hard to do. Only 41 out of the 42 developed countries in the world have figured out how to do it. In other words, we're the only country, or one of very few countries, that have most of our hip care replacement funded by private insurance. If we look at public insurance, right, it's still more than twice as expensive for public insurance. And so the issue is, right, not that we're getting a lot of healthcare and it's expensive, or that we're using a lot of new experimental procedures or medicines that are more expensive. The issue is that our routine medical care is much more expensive in the United States than it is anywhere else in the developed world. And this gets us to then the fourth problem, which is really, I think, the first root problem, which is that we have highly concentrated ownership and financialization and for-profit management of healthcare provision in the United States. We have a patchwork system in which most people get their health insurance through employer-provided plans. Those plans are provided by private insurance companies, the big four. United Health Group is on our mind because of the recent assassination of their CEO. CVS, Cigna, Humana are deeply vertically integrated, right? Meaning that they have come to buy hospitals, doctors' practices, which are now mainly organized in chains, urgent care facilities, pharmacies. And it's stunning to note, right, that 50 years ago, the majority of doctors in the United States were self-employed. They were providing services in their offices for their patients, managing their patients in the way that they saw fit in their judgment. Today, 80% of doctors in the United States are employed by a major healthcare conglomerate, and they do not get to make the healthcare decisions, right? There's a very high rate of burnout in medical professionals, and this has to do with the fact that they, in their judgment, decide that a patient needs a certain kind of care, a certain procedure, a certain medicine, a certain surgery, and somebody above them says no, right? Not going to do it, not covered by the insurance, not a good use of our resources. And then the doctor, rather than being able to care for the patient, has to fight the administrators. And by the way, one of the reasons our healthcare is so expensive is not only that the administrators are trying to squeeze profit out of it and only therefore, right, covering the procedures that are absolutely necessary to save the life of the patient once the disease is acute, disease management, right, as opposed to disease prevention, or even better, right, health maintenance. Those two things are not very profitable, and they're easier to deny in terms of insurance. And so we just don't do those things that make our population healthier nearly as well as the rest of the developed world. But then recognize, in addition to that, we're paying a lot of money for this administrative layer whose function is primarily to scrutinize and make it very difficult for doctors to give the care that they believe their patients need. So we have administrative bloat. It's eating up a lot of our healthcare dollars. We have a for-profit model. And so the deeper conversation here is not about whether or not, right, the Affordable Care Act subsidies need to be extended. I think, clearly, if we want to have a lot of people getting health insurance, then we should do that. But the deeper problem is that we have a broken medical care system, and the Affordable Care Act is an effort to address the symptom of that broken system, not to address the root problem. And that gets us to the final level of root problem I would highlight, which is the total capture and paralysis of the legislative and policy-making process in this country. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, I'm sure. I've got the fancy charts and diagrams to make it a little bit more concrete and a little bit more specific, but you know that the healthcare system in this country is broken and works much less well than the healthcare systems of almost every other comparably rich country in the world. And by the way, we also know there's not a snowflake's chance in hell that we're going to fix this over the next 3 years, right? When right, Donald Trump is asked the obvious question, if you want to eliminate Obamacare, what would you replace it with? Do you have a plan? And he says, well, I have a concept of a plan. And we know that when he was in the presidency in his first term, and he just tried to repeal Obamacare, he didn't have any satisfactory alternative. And the reason is because this is really hard to do. There is a multi-trillion-dollar industry or complex of industries, healthcare, insurance, pharmaceuticals, who lobby like hell to maintain the profitability of their industries. And what is best for all of us, for the American people, right? Replacing this system is bad for the CEOs, is bad for the investors, the shareholders, and right, the result is that the concentrated few who profit from this industry overwhelm the diffuse many who would benefit from replacing it with a more functional system, and that's not going to change. right? Not going to change anytime soon. What would be required is something that doesn't seem to be politically possible at this moment in our country's history, which is one party dominance of our legislature. Right now, we have rough partisan parity, and frankly, this is a chicken and egg kind of problem, right? Part of the reason people are souring on Donald Trump right now is that he's not solving the affordability problem, the related wage stagnation problem, the related problem of inequality. Actually, right, he's making it worse, as we are well aware. He's making it worse with regards to Obamacare. He's making it worse overall in terms of tariffs and the one big beautiful bill. I'll come back to this stuff. It just occurred to me I could illustrate what I'm saying to you. But frankly, the Democrats have a hard time addressing it in the time frame of an election cycle, and so they don't get enough, right, power to pass legislation that might do something about this either. And so we're stuck with a bad, dysfunctional, and, right, ultimately a healthcare system that is making Americans suffer. That means that our life expectancy, again, we're the only developed country in the world where the life expectancy is going down, not up, right? We used to lead the industrial world in life expectancy. We're now at the very bottom and moving in the wrong direction. So, having said all of that, to come back now with this deeper appreciation of what the background to this fight over the Affordable Care Act subsidies um, illuminates, let us return to the question of the shutdown of the government. And here I'll just ask quite simply, did the Democrats accomplish what they hoped for? And here I do think one of the things that is worthwhile noting is that the Democrats didn't really know what they wanted, right? Or they couldn't agree on what they wanted. The fighting over the Affordable Care Act subsidies was the best they could do to sustain their coalition for a while. But the real right reason many of them are fighting is because of the authoritarianism, because of the abuse of power, but they couldn't say that. Some of them wanted to go after the tariffs, but it didn't look like that would work as well as going after the ACA subsidies. But the, I think, right answer that would say yes, they got really what they could get out of this fight would be to say they really succeeded in highlighting the priorities of Donald Trump and the Republican Party and the way in which they contrast with the priorities of the Democratic Party. That while, right, the Democrats are fighting to try to keep health care affordable, Donald Trump is fighting to try to remove the supplemental nutrition assistance benefits in order, right, to bring pressure to bear on the Democrats, right? It's a stark contrast. And by the way, at the same time that those benefits are not going out, he's tearing down the East Wing of the White House to build a grotesque, disproportionate ballroom, right? So that he can Mar-a-Lagify the White House. He's, right, having a Gilded Age Halloween party at Mar-a-Lago. He's taking a Rolodex from a foreign company. This is, right, as clear as it can be. And so that would be the positive case. The negative case would be to say, no, look, we had a lot of leverage. We were actually succeeding in bringing the screws tighter and tighter on the president, and we should have held out for doing this. And by the way, right, Americans are now going to be forced to pay on average more than $1,000 or more for health insurance next year, those reliant on the Affordable Care Act. And by the way, the Democrats were fighting primarily for Trump supporters' benefits. This is a good thing for them to, right, hold the line on. But having said that, I'm going to suggest a third way of looking at this, which is it's not clear cut in either direction. When you have tens of millions of hungry people and a ruthless president. You, as I've already suggested, if you're a decent person, have to weigh on the other side of the issue the fact that you can do something now that will get these people the resources they need not to experience hunger and anxiety. And then you add, right? Hundreds of thousands of government employees are furloughed or not getting paychecks. And that is obviously bad for them. That causes tremendous stress for them. And by the way, it's bad for the larger economy. It's bad for the larger economy because there are other people who provide services to the government workers when they're going to work, and they're losing their jobs. There's estimates that more than 60,000 jobs have been lost as a result of the government shutdown for 60,000 private sector jobs, right? And by the way, the government workers are not spending money. They don't have the money to spend. They're being careful, and that damages the broader economy, particularly in places like DC or Maryland or Virginia. And then also, we're not collecting the data we need, we're not analyzing it, we're not preparing the reports to make sound economic policy decisions. And so, in all these ways, the shutdown was damaging all of us. But let me then add one final consideration. This is a Democratic Party, right, that in 2024 looked to be completely inept or in utter disarray, right? It said our number one priority is to defeat Donald Trump, but then it couldn't get Joe Biden out of the way so that there could be an open and contested primary. It then, once it became obvious that that's what it should have done, handed off the candidacy for the President of the United States to Kamala Harris, who was untested on this stage and who turned out not to have what it took to defeat Donald Trump. And a lot of people look at the Democratic Party and say, well, why should I take time off of work on Tuesdays to go vote for this party if it can't do what it considers to be the most essential and important thing? And here's Exhibit B. It, spends 40 plus days with the government shutdown, creating pain and difficulty for all of us, only to fold without having accomplished its goal. Especially young Democrats, more left Democrats, more progressive Democrats are wondering whether this is a party that they should support. And please note, if the Democrats are going to have any chance of checking the autocracy of Donald Trump, of helping the country to correct course, of perhaps exposing some of his corruption and criminality, they have to regain control of Congress in 2026. Was it a mistake? Not because the other considerations don't matter, but because we need to enter 2026 with momentum, with the wind at our back. So you may have heard I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth. I'm trying to indicate that there isn't, I think, a clear and simple answer to whether or not the Democrats should have reopened the government. I think it's an incredibly complicated question with very good considerations on both sides of the equation. But I'm curious. I bet you guys have views on this also. So why don't I pause here? I do want to talk with you, although I know I'm running low on time, about the climate issue as well. But let's open up the discussion for a moment before we do that, because I'm about to change topics entirely. Anybody have thoughts about whether it was a mistake to close down the government, or about these issues to do with when it was reopened, how it was reopened, and also the deeper issues to do with healthcare and inequality? Sandy, Mike, it looks like both of you have your hands up. Go ahead.
I think that one of the reasons I don't think they folded. I think they decided to come to an agreement so that would force the House to open. And once the House opened, it would force the Epstein files out. And I think they thought that would do more damage than anything else they could do.
Yeah, so interesting observation. And If I've got it right, I haven't said Epstein once today, and I was kind of proud of that, but I guess now I'm going to have to
Sorry.
talk about Jeffrey Epstein for a moment here. No, I think it's fine. And so in looking at Donald Trump's decreasing approval rating, another explanation would be that the way in which he is doggedly fighting the release of these files seems to indicate that he is implicated in them. And by the way, the emails, the tranche of emails that were released on well last week, right? And those are not the Epstein files, right? That's the congressional uh, subpoena of the records from the Epstein estate, but they seem to not look good for the president, right? I would put it this way, that this scandal, right? And please note, right, that there's nothing that is, I think, a smoking gun that says Donald Trump was, you know, having sex with minors while hanging out with or because they have been trafficked and provided by Jeffrey Epstein, right? And I don't know. It would frankly surprise me if that information is there and hasn't come out yet, given how much attention this issue has received. And on the other hand, right, the fact that Donald Trump is fighting so doggedly to prevent these files, is acting the way a corrupt politician acts, and that this is exposing, I think, minimally the idea that he is not the person who's going to cure the corruption of not just American government, but the entire American elite class. And when I say their corruption, their indifference to the well-being of their fellow citizens, right? That they're and so I think, the idea that Epstein somehow managed to get hundreds of millions of dollars for doing almost nothing while engaging in clearly criminal activity, got caught, and then got off with a slap on the wrist and continued to make lots of money and do the same thing, indicates that there's something broken in our society, right? As far as the people who focus on this are concerned, that the people like him are just living by a different set of rules. They don't get punished when they do wrong, and they do terrible things because they're terrible people. And by the way, that is an indictment of the entire economic, political, and social elite. And they thought maybe Donald Trump was going to bring them down, was going to really fight for the people who have been victimized by the predatory behavior of the elite, not because they've been sexually trafficked, right? That those are the worst of the worst offenses, but because they've had their jobs destroyed, because their communities have not been rebuilt once the jobs went abroad, etc. And this exposes Donald Trump as not fighting for them. Right. So I think of this as kind of akin to some of these other issues, but I also don't think, frankly, from listening to the senators who decided to um, right sign on to the continuing resolution legislation, that this was top of their mind. And so yes, there is a strategic calculation. If you allow the Senate to pass the continuing resolution, the House has to reconvene. Then, right, the person who hasn't been allowed to take up her seat for 6, 7, 8 weeks, however long it is, gets to take her seat, gets to sign the petition, gets to then call for a vote, and presumably the House is going to vote to subpoena these records. Um, I think there's some advantage to this, to the Democrats. I think this is the kind of scandal that is not going to, right, bring Donald Trump down. I'm not sure if there is a scandal. Look, we already know um, that he's been fined millions of dollars for having sexually assaulted a woman. We already know that in the Access Hollywood tapes that he brags about this kind of conduct, right? He's not even ashamed of it. He's, he thinks it's the kind of thing that one should uh, take credit for. So if this didn't keep Donald Trump from the presidency, I don't think it's going to get him out of the presidency. But having said that, it may continue his downward spiral, and it may damage him with his key supporters, not because they care that he's a rapist or a pedophile or a predator, but because they think that he is the person who is going to bring the elite to justice and to heal and make America start working again for people like them. And this just exposes the obvious fact that that's not who he is. So yes, I do think that this may be a side effect of reopening the government. No, I don't think that's why the senators voted to reopen the government. Thank you for the comments, Andy. Thank you for dragging me down into the nasty dirt of the Epstein file. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, this is just a footnote to your uh, analysis of what's wrong with the health system. And one of the big sources of unnecessary expense, impairment of the ability of physicians to be available to do the job that we need them to do, is the abuse produced by medical malpractice suits by the industrialized sector of the law industry, if you know what I mean. They've
Yeah, I
driven
know.
they've driven costs up for providing medical care. They've driven whole sectors of medical practice uh, to leave certain parts of the country where the juries are susceptible to over uh, uh, penalizing physicians and so forth. It's a
Yeah,
footnote.
yeah, and I don't know, and I guess I should do some research to try to figure out what portion of the right over expenditure on inadequate medical care is due to the need of doctors to have malpractice insurance, because there's no doubt, right, at this point, my understanding from my doctor friends is you just assume you're going to get sued once, twice a year, right? And probably the insurance company is going to settle the suit rather than fighting it, and it therefore is part of your overhead in your medical practice, or part of the overhead for the hospital or the conglomerate you work for, to insure you so that when the suit happens, they're not on the hook. I know that is definitely part of the landscape of contemporary medical care in the United States. I'm
Right.
just not sure what proportion of the expense is accounted for in that way. But
Well, it's worth researching. I
yeah,
can tell
uh,
I
uh,
can tell you from experience living some part-time in Philadelphia that their whole practice areas have been driven out of town because of the tendency of Philadelphia juries to uh, make outrageous awards to the people bringing these suits.
are you a doctor, Mike?
No, I'm a lawyer.
You're a lawyer. Okay, all right. You saw it from the other side. Yeah. So like I say, I know this from doctors. And by the way, the thing the doctors complain about that I hear most is just the sheer waste of time, right? And so they consider these suits to be frivolous, right? And yet the lawyers are encouraging the patient or the family of the patient, if the patient is deceased, to bring the suit, and then the doctor has to give depositions and the doctor has to go to court, and oftentimes these cases drag out over, right, 4 or 5 6 years, and there's a regular updating of the deposition, etc. And so yes, I do know that this is an issue not only in Philadelphia but elsewhere in the country.
And it's worthy of some research.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and by the way, if we had a public health care system, we might be able to address this issue as well in the
Yeah.
enabling legislation. All right, anybody else with a thought about these kinds of questions? The broader issue of the shutdown, the Democrats' decision, or the decision of this nub of Democrats to open the government again? So do you want me, I see the time, to spend a couple minutes just introducing what's happening at COP30, and then we can go into more length at this next week. I started late. I can give you another couple of minutes if you want. So let me just get the slides back up. I think I actually had one more political slide, by the way, which has to do with right, the um, fact, the obvious facts. I kind of alluded to this already, that Donald Trump has succeeded in expanding the base of the Republican Party primarily by assembling a working class and increasingly a multiracial working class coalition to support him. And these are precisely the people who will be hurt not only by taking away the Affordable Care Act subsidies, but a variety of other provisions in the One Big Beautiful Bill. Provisions that tighten the eligibility for SNAP, for food assistance, that tighten the eligibility for unemployment assistance, for Medicaid. And so, right, the idea that the Democrats are calling attention to the fact that Donald Trump is, in order to give a tax break that primarily benefits the top 10% and especially the wealthiest people in this country, doing things that damage the bottom 80% of our society, especially the economically vulnerable, is part of what I think the Democrats have succeeded in calling attention to. All right, COP30, right? And as the Paris Accords turn 10, I'll say this very quickly, right? There are a series of priorities in this most recent get together of all of the countries in the world who participate in the Paris Climate Accords, and that's almost every country in the world except for the United States under Donald Trump. And by the way, it appears that most of the countries in the world, most of the activists on climate change, are happy that the United States is not there, because under Donald Trump, at least, the United States is a major impediment to action on these issues. So what are the priorities, right? Six thematic axes: transitioning energy, industry, and transport, stewarding forests, oceans, and biodiversities, transforming agriculture and the food system, building resilience for cities, infrastructure, and water, and fostering human and social development. And then they add one other, which is building broad-based coalitions, and they put it as unleashing enablers and accelerators, including on financial technology and capacity building. So not just concentrate on these five, but ask who is going to actually be effective at carrying these five into the future, and what can we do to help them. Now, I also, right, would highlight for you that there are 30 more specific objectives, and I wanted to highlight three of them: tripling renewables and doubling energy efficiency. Investing, so that's number one under, right, transitioning energy, industry, and transport. Stewarding forests and oceans is the second priority, and I was going to focus on forests and oceans, right? And so that's where I'm going. But just to leave off for today, I'm going to point out, and I think we lose track of this. 2025 has been such a traumatic and difficult and dense year politically that I think it feels much longer than 11 months ago that Los Angeles was burning, that a section of Los Angeles the size of Manhattan, right, was basically destroyed. And when we look at the degree of the damage, right, uh, square blocks where only maybe 3 or 4 houses are left intact and everything else, right, burned to the ground. The Altadena neighborhood completely destroyed, right? And the investigation into this fire has revealed, and I think it's worth noting, right, that this fire apparently was started by an individual. By the way, he almost immediately called the fire department. They were almost immediately on the scene. They extinguished the fire and continued to monitor it. And that this is an increasingly common phenomenon, that the fire retreated underground, right, and smoldered there for days, right, until it re-erupted. And this reflects the fact that in January in Los Angeles, the ground and the biomass underneath the ground was much drier and more combustible than it should be that time of year, right? And so it's not just that these fires happen and that we're driven by the winds because climate change is making the atmosphere hotter and drier and more energetic. It's also the case that the underlying scenario that created this fire is the product of climate change. And then to fast forward to what's happening more or less contemporaneously right now, when we look at the coastal United States, um, and in particular, right, the sea coasts of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, that are being impacted by an increasingly energetic hurricane season, the houses being destroyed, the erosion of the barrier islands, the beaches, the natural protection. And then we notice, right, if we project out to 2050, right, these same areas, the ocean is going to be so much hotter, the right storms so much more energetic, that we have a disaster already arriving, and we're just detecting the very beginning of what's coming. And so there's a deep urgency to making the Paris Accords work. This is what they're focused on in Brazil this week, next week. Maybe by next week there will be actual outcomes for us to discuss as well. But I do feel duty bound to pay some attention to that, despite all of the energy and bleakness of American politics right now. We're not the only show in town. So that's where we'll turn to next week. Any initial thoughts or questions about that before we call it a day? Flossie, I see you. I can't unmute you. You got to do that yourself. Let me see if I can send you something that helps you do that. Did that help? Yes, good. Go
Thinking
ahead.
one of my students works with the Mexican population in LA, and her stories are equally horrible. You would think that the days of the farm workers was over. It isn't. The poverty is there, but the fear of deportation plagues them, and they don't know where to turn. They don't know how to seek advice. If they seek it, they are turned in directions that make it impossible for them to get any help. And of course, her articles are being appreciated, and she is being credited with doing good work, but she finds it difficult to bear. It is so painful. And we live with that, and we live with the problem of growing old too, and how much we can take on our shoulders. And I feel it very, very deeply. So there you are.
Yeah, Flossie, thank you for the comment. And I'll just say this very briefly. I'm teaching a work by a law professor, somebody I actually know, Ashana Schifrin at UCLA, on democratic law. And part of what she emphasizes, and I find it to be very moving and compelling, is that when you have, right, a moral duty, take it a duty to show gratitude, right? Um, that it's one thing to mouth the words, "Thank you, I appreciate that," right? But if your conduct does not also indicate that you are genuinely grateful to someone, then they may come to conclude that you don't really acknowledge your obligation to show gratitude to them, right? And that in this sense, when we have political duties, it's not enough to say this is not what I want my government to be doing. This is wrong. This is unjust. This is brutal. This is mean. This is cruel. And I hate it, right? That in some sense, we have to act as well in ways that show that we support and that we want to do our best to aid or comfort those who are being victimized in our names, right? This is our government doing this to them. And so I use this as a way of connecting to what your former student is doing, Flossie. And you know, I've heard the stories of the school teachers who are getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning in Los Angeles to patrol their neighborhoods, to look for ICE, to then contribute to a message board online that says, stay clear of this block or this area because that's where ICE is active this morning, right? That there's a kind of cat and mouse game going on right now with the good people of Los Angeles and the occupiers who are trying to deport them. And it's going on in many other places in the country as well. And so, yes, I do think one of the things we should be thinking about, I thanked you guys last week when I learned that you had worked to find food banks and to try to assist people in need in your area. I do think one of the things we should be doing is thinking about concretely, if we really, really despise what our government is doing right now, what can we be doing to make it clear to our fellow citizens, to the people in our country who are providing us services that we need, that we want to support them, that we do support them, and that we will do our best to protect them and to shelter them as we can. I think that's what the sanctuary city movement is about, but I do think, frankly, in 2025, we need to be thinking about what else we can do. And of course, we're watching this come for North Carolina next. It's spreading in an awful way as long as Trump is undiminished, undeterred, unchecked in his execution of this, right, vile priority. Thank you, Flossie. I think that's maybe a good note to leave it on for today. You guys take care, and I'll look forward to seeing everybody next week. All right, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure as always. You guys.
Thank you, David.
But thank you. Take care, Jonathan. Bye, everybody. See you soon. See you next week. Bye.